Hey guys, welcome to another Genshin Impact video. Today I'll be discussing Chongyun in a Shattered team composition and how to make the most out of your Hydro and Cryo characters. Now to begin, I would again like to say Chongyun is by no means the best main DPS, as his basic attack skill multiplier are considerably low compared to other Claymore users. This video's purpose is to discuss how to make the most out of Chongyun, and with that, let's get straight into the video. Shattered mechanics. The Shattered reaction is a transformative reaction that occurs after applying a heavy or geo attack on a frozen target. Heavy attacks can be both skills and claymore hits. The game registers several attacks that are not claymore attacks as heavy, thus these skills or attacks can shatter, which is why we define them as heavy. The Shattered reaction does a fixed amount of physical damage based on your character's level, elemental mastery, and enemy's physical resistance. I would like to add that this means that physical damage bonus, which can be found on artifacts or weapons, does not increase the reaction damage. Now in order for Chongyun to freeze a target, the player must apply Hydro and Cryo on the enemy. Commonly in a Shattered comp, these Hydro supports are Saintio, Mona, and Barbara. Furthermore, the most common heavy attack that is not considered a claymore hit would be Chongyun's Elemental Burst, where each icicle has the ability to proc a Shattered reaction and deal additional physical damage. Lastly, in the case of an enemy having little to no downtime maintaining the wet status, a heavy attack that applies Cryo can both shatter and freeze a target at the same time. This can be seen on screen where Chongyun's basic attack consistently freezes and shatters a target after we wait for the internal cooldown of his infused cryo attacks to end. For the people who don't know what an internal cooldown or an ICD is, it is basically a period of time where you cannot apply an element if the element comes from the same source. This would be Chongyun's basic attack, which is considered as one source, meaning Chongyun's basic attacks don't apply cryo for all hits, however deal cryo damage. I would also like to add the duration of a freeze on a target is dependent on how much time remaining from either Hydro or Cryo is on the enemy. This means that when one element is removed over time or ends over time, either Hydro or Cryo, the target defrosts. Also, the Shattered reaction in this scenario for Chongyun's basic attacks and a weak 1U of Hydro removes both Hydro and Cryo on the enemy. Basically, it's like when Chongyun shatters, no aura is left on the enemy. Okay, so now that we are done discussing the mechanics of Shattered, we will now look into how we want to build our Chongyun. We want to either run the 4-piece Gladiator set or the 4-piece Blizzard Strayer, the new announced Cryo artifact set. We run Gladiators as most of our damage in the Shattered team composition comes from Chongyun's basic attacks. Therefore, the 35 bonus damage percent boosts Chongyun's damage significantly. On the other hand, we can also run the 4-piece Blizzard Strayer for the additional crit rate and cryo bonus damage it provides. However, if you watched my previous video on the announced cryo set, I discussed how Chongyun's effective crit rate is actually much lower than the expected 40%. If you haven't already, I highly suggest you check it out as I provide different calculations of the cryo set's effective crit rate as well as cryo resonance at C0 versus C1 and with other team synergies. I then used the lowered effective crit rate to compare both sets manually with no substats and through a fellow theory crafter simulation with optimized substats, basically the skill damage ceiling. So based on the simulations, we found that the basic attack in a Shattered team composition, the best in slot artifact set would be Gladiators. However, this can change depending on your cryo application, C0 versus C1, and this simulation does not take into account E and your Q damage. However, the best and safest option to go would be the 4-piece Gladiators, and that is what I plan on doing when I finally get a good attack percent sandpiece. Note, these simulations to get the highest possible damage use C1 as reference and still showed a lower total basic attack damage output than Gladiators. Now for the main stats, we want to run attack percent, cryo bonus damage, and crit rate or crit damage. We want to run attack percent Sands of Aeon in this scenario because number 1, depending on your opponents, we can't always proc a reaction. This is due to innate auras. And number 2, Our elemental skill, burst, and basic attack all scale with attack percent, which is why it's the safer option. As for Hydro supports, I would rank Xingqiu as first, Mona as second, and Barbara as third. Xingqiu is Chongyun's best Shattered enabler, as each of his Guhua swords that comes out of his elemental burst have their own Hydro source, thus can apply Hydro each wave, or every 1 second. In addition, these Hydro swords hit the enemy before Chongyun lands the basic attack, which makes this all the more satisfying and fun to play around. Mona comes in second as you have to wait for her E cooldown, and her elemental burst doesn't really benefit transformative reactions as much as amplifying reactions does. When compared to Xingqiu, she also doesn't provide additional survivability, where Xingqiu can give damage resistance and heal. Barbara is third because although she provides healing, she doesn't provide any damage which Chongyun heavily lacks. In addition, Barbara has an internal cooldown for her Hydro Aura of around 1 to 2 seconds, which makes it a very unreliable Hydro source, or rather, more unreliable compared to Xingqiu. Now we will discuss other support slot options. These include Cryo, Anemo, and Electro supports. For Cryo supports, if you want to increase the frequency of our Shattered reactions, Kea is our best option, as his elemental burst makes it so that almost all of Chongyun's basic attacks performs a Shattered reaction. We also have both Chichi and Diona in the team, if your team doesn't currently have any heals or lack sustain. For Anemo, we have Sucrose, Venti, and Jean, all to proc the 4-piece VV set bonus. For Electro, I really only recommend Fischl, as her off-screen Electro is the most reliable among other Electro supports. Now for the question, should I run an Anemo support or Electro support for either Viridescent or Superconduct? To answer this, you almost always want to run an Anemo support over any Superconduct or Electro support. This is because increasing our basic attack, skill, and burst damage from Viridescent Fenrir heavily outweighs boosting our Shattered damage from Superconduct. We also need to consider due to ICDs, Shattered is very limited. Thus, Superconduct for Shattered doesn't really scale well. For the options of Anemo, we run Sucrose, we get similar results compared to Fischl, and she passes Elemental Mastery for the entire team. Now, if we try to maximize our Shattered frequency with Kea, our comp would look like this: Chongyun, Xingqiu, Kea, and Fischl. In my opinion, this team composition would then be lacking heals or sustain for the entire. This is because in order for us to have the highest possible amount of Shatters, we must run Chongyun, Xingqiu, and Kea. One could argue that we could run Xingqiu as a healer, however, it is not reliable as we lose out on so much more damage if we do so, that it is better to run an Anemo support that can heal. Which brings me to my next point, which is the ideal comp, or what I call the refreeze comp. What I see as an ideal team composition for the most Shatters would be Chongyun, Xingqiu, Kea, and Jean. This is because we aren't relying as much with Elemental Mastery compared to, say, a Melt comp with Sucrose. In addition, C2 Jean provides additional move speed and attack speed for Chongyun, meaning that he can apply Cryo and proc Shatters faster. However, this requires frame testing, and from what I know, attack speed doesn't shorten the amount of frames by a significant amount, and hit lag remains the same amount of frames regardless of attack speed. Kea provides the constant cryo application for what I call the refreeze comp, and Xingqiu doesn't sacrifice damage for the small amount of healing or increase in healing. I believe this team composition would provide the most Shatters and be somewhat viable to run. I also believe that if you run the new cryo set, this would be your best bet, as the amount of freezes Kea provides barely makes it so that at higher investments and due to RNG, it could potentially beat out the 4-piece gladiators if you farmed enough good substats. However, this team composition has its limitations. For one, it's not flexible and doesn't really work well in Abyss. Although Cryo Resonance is good, Pyro is very dominant in Abyss. We also need to consider Fatui shields and the corresponding elements required to break them. Moreover, based on other Chongyun players I know who run him as a main DPS for Shattered, other carries beat out his basic attack damage, which causes him to struggle compared to other characters. I will say that you don't need to follow this refreeze comp, and that a Chongyun, Xingqiu team composition with other supports, say double Anemo, Anemo Geo, another cryo Anemo, will work just as good depending on how much you have already invested in your supports. For weapons, I believe Serpent Spine would work really well with this refreeze comp or a shattered comp in general, just because of the crazy amounts of CC or cryo control you are able to create, preventing you from taking damage, which can help build stacks. Amulet for Chongyun is a good option, however it could better fit Razor, as Superconduct boosts the proc damage of the weapon. And so yeah, that about it wraps the video. If you have any questions or concerns, feel free to message me in the comments or through Discord. Again, as always, make sure to like the video if you've learned something new, and subscribe as I post weekly. Thank you and take care.